There are wars so large that they ought to sit at the center of world memory, and yet somehow they drift to the edges of it. The Taiping Rebellion is one of those wars. It lasted from 1850 into the mid-1860s. It convulsed Qing China across provinces, river systems, cities, villages, market towns, mountains, and fields. It destroyed governments, created new ones, redrew loyalties, wrecked harvests, militarized local society, and left behind a death toll so immense that even historians who disagree about the exact number still speak in millions upon millions. It was not a border war. It was not a palace coup. It was not an uprising that briefly flared and then died. It was a civil war of staggering scale, one of the deadliest conflicts in human history. And for years it placed the Qing Empire itself under a question that seemed impossible in the 18th century and unavoidable in the 19th. Could the dynasty survive at all? To call it a civil war is true, but it is not enough. The Taiping Rebellion was also a religious revolution, a social experiment, a millenarian kingdom, a war of ethnicity, a war of class resentment, a war of state collapse and local reconstruction, a war between visions of China and visions imported, translated, misunderstood, and transformed from elsewhere. It was led by a failed examination candidate from the south named Hong Xiuquan, a man who came to believe that he was the younger brother of Jesus Christ and that he had been commanded by heaven to cleanse the world of demons. It built a state called the Taiping Heavenly Kingdom. It captured one of the great cities of China, Nanjing, and made it its capital under a new name. It promised equality in land, the destruction of idols, the end of opium, the end of foot binding, the smashing of the Confucian social order, and the overthrow of the Manchu Qing dynasty. It also created new hierarchies, harsh disciplines, internal terror, and its own machinery of coercion. Like many movements that claim to be remaking the world, it was fueled by genuine grievance, genuine belief, and a catastrophic capacity for violence. The easiest way to misunderstand the Taiping Rebellion is to imagine that it appeared out of nowhere, as though one visionary man lost his balance and somehow dragged millions into delirium. That is not how it happened. The Taiping movement grew from deep conditions that had been accumulating in Qing China for decades. Population growth that outstripped resources, pressure on land, growing numbers of men who could not secure advancement, fiscal weakness in local administration, corruption, ethnic and lineage tensions in the south, and the moral shock of imperial humiliation in the Opium War. It emerged from a world in which the old order still possessed grandeur, ritual confidence, and immense administrative reach, but increasingly failed to persuade all of its subjects that the old bargain between ruler and ruled still worked. The rebellion was not an accident imposed on a stable China. It was a revelation of how unstable parts of China had already become. This is why the Taiping story matters so much. It was not merely a sideshow to the better-known dramas of 19th century Europe. It was one of the great turning points of modern Asian history. It transformed the Qing state by forcing it to rely less on the old banner armies and more on provincial militarization. It empowered local gentry and commanders in ways that would echo into the self-strengthening era and beyond. It devastated fertile regions along the Yangtze. It altered the relationship between Chinese elites and foreign powers. It changed the political imagination of reform and revolution. And it left behind a historical question that still chills the mind. What happens when a civilization under strain meets a vision of salvation strong enough to create a rival state in the middle of an empire? To tell this story properly, we have to begin before the heavenly kingdom, before the visions, before the banners of the Taiping armies moved northward, before Nanjing became Tianjin, the heavenly capital. We have to begin in Qing China when the empire still looked durable from a distance, yet up close had already begun to fray. Only then does the rebellion make sense. Only then can we understand why so many people followed, why so many others resisted, and why this war, almost unknown to many outside China, became one of the bloodiest events the modern world has ever seen. In the 18th century, the Qing dynasty had looked, to many observers, like one of the strongest political orders on earth. The empire was vast, wealthy, culturally confident, and administered through a bureaucracy that joined classical learning to imperial service. Under emperors such as Kangxi, Yongzheng, and Qianlong, The dynasty had expanded its reach and consolidated its legitimacy. But strength in one century can become burden in the next. By the early 19th century, the Qing state still possessed enormous symbolic authority, yet the pressures bearing down on it were multiplying. Population had surged. Land had not expanded at the same pace. Families divided holdings over generations until plots grew too small to sustain everyone who depended on them. Tenancy increased. Marginal hills and poor soils were cultivated more intensively. Ecological pressure intensified local vulnerability. A bad harvest in such a world was not merely an inconvenience. It could be the beginning of migration, debt, banditry, or hunger. The imperial examination system, for centuries one of the great mechanisms of social aspiration in China, added another form of pressure. In theory, it allowed talent and learning to rise into official service. In practice, by the 19th century, it also generated enormous disappointment. More and more candidates competed for a limited number of degrees and appointments. A young man could devote years, even the best years of his life, to mastering the canonical texts and still fail. His failure was not just personal. It had social meaning. It affected family prestige, lineage ambition, and the local hierarchy of respect. In a world where education was one of the few imaginable roads upward, repeated failure could corrode identity itself. At the same time, the empire's fiscal and administrative systems were under stress. The state had long prided itself on relatively light taxation, but light taxation also meant limited reserves when crisis deepened. Local administration often depended on magistrates with vast responsibilities and inadequate means. Corruption, informal exactions, and the gap between official ideals and daily realities were widely known. None of this meant the Qing order had already collapsed. It meant that the order increasingly asked ordinary people to endure strain while offering less assurance that the state could mediate that strain fairly. Then came the Opium War. The military conflict with Britain in 1839 to 1842 did not directly cause the Taiping Rebellion, but it profoundly changed the emotional landscape in which the rebellion would grow. The defeat exposed weaknesses in the Qing military and administrative machine. Treaty ports, indemnities, and foreign pressure did not just humiliate the court in diplomatic terms. They shook confidence in the old idea that the empire stood securely at the center of the world. For some Chinese observers, the lesson was not yet clear. For others, the war suggested that heaven might no longer favor the dynasty in the same unquestioned way. Foreign intrusion, silver flows, opium addiction, and treaty arrangements fed a larger atmosphere of disorder and disorientation. The south, especially Guangxi, was a particularly combustible region. There the landscape of mountain valleys, ethnic diversity, migration, lineage competition, and poor soils had long made local conflict more intense. Hakka communities, migrants who often lacked the entrenched landholding position of longer settled groups, lived amid recurring tension with other Han populations. Competition over land, water, and status could easily become violent. Secret societies flourished. Local feuds and armed bands were common enough that the boundary between ordinary social competition and insurgency could be thin. A world already full of local militias and semi-organized violence is a world in which a visionary movement can gain a military body more quickly than outsiders expect. This was the setting into which Hong Xiuquan came of age. A Qing empire still formally majestic, but increasingly unable to convert that majesty into security at the village and county level. A society in which examination hopes were immense and exam failure devastating. A southern world of land pressure, ethnic tension, and private violence. And a wider imperial horizon darkened by foreign intrusion and moral shock. The Taiping movement would later speak in the language of heaven, revelation, and universal transformation. But its roots ran through rent, land, status, and the long disappointment of those who had begun to suspect that the old order no longer knew how to answer their hunger. Hong Xiuquan was born in 1814 in Guangdong province, into a Hakka family that placed immense hope in education. He was not born a prophet. He was born into the ordinary but heavy ambitions that shaped many families in late imperial China. Like countless other young men, he was set on the path of the examinations. Success in the exam system could bring honor, office, and the transformation of family fortunes. Failure could bring shame, frustration, and a life haunted by what might have been. Hong was intelligent, serious, and intensely ambitious. He studied the classics. He sat for exams. He failed. Then he failed again. Failure in the examinations should never be treated as a mere biographical detail in Hong's life. It was central. The exam system did more than sort candidates. It structured emotional life. It told men what counted as achievement. It told families where to place hope. It linked self-worth to a social ladder that, for most, remained maddeningly out of reach. Hong's repeated defeats did not simply block a career. They destabilized the world that had given his efforts meaning. After one of these failures, in 1837, Hong suffered what contemporaries described as a collapse or illness accompanied by extraordinary visions. The content of those visions would later become the theological heart of the Taiping movement. At first, however, they remained unintegrated experiences, strange and powerful, but not yet fully interpreted. He saw heavenly figures, a majestic father, a venerable elder brother, demons to be destroyed, and a cosmic mission implied but not yet made precise. Only later, when he revisited Christian tracts that had previously passed through his hands, did he come to believe that he understood what the visions had meant. The father was God, the elder brother was Jesus, and he himself was the younger brother, chosen to cleanse the world. That interpretive turn is one of the most consequential misreadings in world history. Hong did not become an Orthodox Protestant convert. He did not simply absorb missionary doctrine. He fused elements of Christian literature, Chinese moral language, his own visions, anti-idolatry, and apocalyptic certainty into something new and explosive. The result was neither traditional Chinese religion nor standard Christianity, but a hybrid revelation that was, in Hong's mind, more truthful than both. He saw the world as corrupted by demons and false worship. He saw the Manchu Qing rulers not merely as political enemies, but as part of a demonic order to be overthrown. He saw himself as heaven's appointed agent. This theology cannot be reduced to madness, though outsiders often tried. It had internal logic. It offered dignity to failure by transforming the failed exam candidate into a chosen cosmic actor. It replaced the humiliating uncertainty of the examinations with an absolute certainty of mission. It connected social grievance to divine command. It gave ordinary followers a place in a universe that was no longer governed by dusty degrees and local lineages, but by a heavenly king and a redemptive war. Hong did not build the movement alone. One of the most important figures in the early spread of his ideas was Feng Yunshan, whose organizing ability and missionary zeal helped turn Hong's visions into a social network. In Guangxi, among communities already unsettled by poverty, migration, and conflict, the God worshippers movement began to gather followers. These were not only the desperate, though desperation mattered. They were also men and women seeking moral clarity, solidarity, protection, and a framework that could explain why the old world seemed both unjust and vulnerable. A movement with theology, but no organization remains a sect. A movement with theology, networks, discipline, and enemies can become an army. Guangxi was the place where ideas hardened into insurgency. It was a region of hills, mining districts, river valleys, ethnic diversity, and recurrent violence. Secret societies operated there. Feuds could become battles. Local authority was often weak or compromised. To the Qing state, Guangxi could look distant, difficult, and troublesome. To the God worshippers, it looked like soil in which a new order might actually grow. There was room to gather, room to preach, room to arm, and room to turn belief into social defense. The God worshippers were not originally a state. They were a movement built around worship practices, anti-idolatry, moral discipline, and the authority of Hong's revelations. They broke idols. They attacked temples. They denounced Confucian orthodoxy and local ritual worlds that had long tied communities to the established order. They called people into a new religious life, but that life was never only spiritual. It was social and martial. Followers found in the movement not just salvation, but mutual aid, organization, and in many cases armed protection. In a landscape already familiar with local violence, this mattered. As the late 1840s turned into 1850, pressure increased. Local officials and militia forces saw the god worshippers as dangerous. The movement saw itself as persecuted and chosen. This is a familiar revolutionary escalation. Repression confirms prophecy. Prophecy justifies militancy. Militancy invites further repression, and each side increasingly interprets the other not as merely mistaken, but as fundamentally illegitimate. By 1850, the dynamic was becoming difficult to contain. Hong and his followers were no longer just a dissident religious grouping. They were becoming the nucleus of an armed revolution. The outbreak, conventionally known as the Jintian Uprising in January 1851, marked the transition. There, in Guangxi, the movement formally raised the banner of rebellion against the Qing. Hong proclaimed the Taiping Tianghua, the heavenly kingdom of great peace. The name itself was extraordinary. It did not describe a local defense league or a reform petition. It announced a rival sovereignty under heaven. The movement was now not merely against the Qing. It was an alternative to the Qing, with its own title to rule, its own sacred legitimacy, and its own claim on the future of China. Names matter in revolutionary history because names set scale. A title like Heavenly Kingdom does not leave much room for compromise. It implies universality, redemption, and a moral totality that ordinary dynastic politics cannot easily meet halfway. Once Hong's movement spoke in that voice, every military engagement became more than local self-defense. It became part of an apocalyptic war over who legitimately occupied the center of the world. The early Taiping armies were not professional in the sense of European standing forces, but they possessed qualities that made them formidable: strong collective belief, intense discipline, organizational zeal, and the moral energy of people convinced they were fighting in a cosmic struggle. The movement also drew strength from social grievances. Many recruits were Hakka, many were poor. Many had reasons to hate local structures of land, tax, lineage dominance, and official indifference. But the Taiping movement was not reducible to one ethnicity or one class. It was a coalition of belief, grievance, and opportunity, and its leaders understood that momentum itself could recruit. The first years of the rebellion revealed a pattern that would repeat in revolutionary wars across history. The movement's most daring early advances were enabled not only by its own fervor, but by the weakness of the forces sent against it. Qing troops in the region were often poorly led, corrupt, badly coordinated, or lacking the morale to crush a movement that seemed to grow under pressure. Imperial weakness did not create Taiping strength, but it magnified it. And each victory made the rebellion feel less like an impossible dream and more like a new political reality. From Jintian, the Taiping movement began to move. Its early campaigns were brutal, improvised, and mobile. They were not the stately operations of an established dynasty, but the expanding warpath of a revolutionary kingdom still making itself by conquest. Towns and garrisons fell. Recruits streamed in. Command structures hardened. Sacred language and military organization became inseparable. Taiping commanders preached, punished, marched, and fought inside the same frame of meaning. Heaven had chosen them. Demons ruled the present world, and the Qing order was doomed. One of the first important strongholds they took was Yong'an. Holding territory mattered because it gave the Taiping movement room to consolidate, organize, and articulate. It was there that titles, ranks, and a more developed political structure became clearer. Hong Xiuquan stood as heavenly king. Beneath him emerged other kings, including Yang Xiuqing, Xiao Chaogui, Wei Chonghui, Shi Dakai, and others who would shape the rebellion's fate. These titles were not ornamental. They were offices in a new sacred political order. The movement was inventing a government while at war, and war was the condition under which that government made sense. Yang Xiuqing would become especially important. A charcoal seller by background, he rose through the movement by force of charisma and claimed spirit possession by the voice of God the Father. In a kingdom already grounded in revelation, the ability to speak as heaven's living authority mattered enormously. Hong might be the heavenly king and younger brother of Jesus, but Yang could intervene in the present with divine commands. This created power and danger in equal measure. The Taiping leadership was a hierarchy born not from bureaucratic procedure, but from overlapping claims of sanctity, military ability, and revolutionary legitimacy. Such structures can conquer quickly. They can also become internally murderous. The Taiping movement's early laws were severe. Men and women were organized under strict regulations. Sexual separation was enforced. Opium, alcohol, gambling, prostitution, and many ordinary patterns of popular life were condemned. Hair, clothing, worship, and conduct all became political. The new order did not merely ask for loyalty. It sought to refashion daily life. That was part of its appeal and part of its terror. For followers, the heavenly kingdom promised moral purification. For opponents or doubters, it looked like a social machine bent on erasing the familiar world. As the Taiping armies left Guangxi and moved northward, their transformation accelerated. Their march was one of the most astonishing military movements of the century. They did not simply survive. They expanded into the arteries of China. They took cities. They traversed enormous distances. They exploited Qing's slowness and confusion. They turned local victories into an imperial crisis. This northward movement revealed something crucial about the rebellion. It was not a mountain insurrection content to dominate one corner of the south. Its leaders believed in conquest at scale. The heavenly kingdom was not envisioned as one regional refuge among many. It was supposed to replace the dynasty. That is why their route toward the Yangtze and beyond mattered so much. The Yangtze Valley was one of the great economic and demographic cores of the empire. Control there meant not only military prestige, but access to transport, grain, taxation bases, and symbolic centrality. To move into that world was to tell the Qing that the rebellion had ceased to be provincial noise. It was now a claim on China itself. Panic followed the Taiping advance. Qing officials sent troops, issued memorials, blamed one another, and tried to contain a disaster that kept outrunning their administrative logic. The court in Beijing still inhabited the rituals of dynastic centrality, but reports from the south increasingly described a movement that spoke in the language of total overthrow. To the Qing, the Taiping were rebels. To themselves, they were the new rightful order under heaven. Those are the two positions from which civil wars become wars of annihilation. The capture of Nanjing in March 1853 was the great turning point of the rebellion's first phase. If the uprising in Guangxi announced the birth of a rival kingdom, Nanjing made that kingdom terrifyingly real. Nanjing was not a frontier outpost. It was one of China's great historic capitals, a city saturated with imperial memory, strategic value, and symbolic weight. To seize it was to seize not just walls and arsenals, but a place from which rule could be imagined in truly national terms. The assault and its aftermath were catastrophic. Qing defenders, and especially the city's Manchu population, were slaughtered in scenes of extraordinary brutality. The anti-Manchu ferocity of the Taiping movement was not incidental. The Qing dynasty was ruled by Manchus, and although Han Chinese elites had long been integrated into its administrative order, anti-Manchu sentiment could still be mobilized as revolutionary fire. The Taiping depicted the ruling dynasty not just as corrupt, but as alien usurpers, demonic oppressors to be extirpated. Such language had consequences. Nanjing was not simply taken, it was purged. Once in control, the Taiping renamed the city Tianjin, the heavenly capital. The renaming was itself an act of statecraft. Nanjing, with its old dynastic associations, belonged to the historical order. Tianjin belonged to the new dispensation. A sacred city now stood at the center of a sacred kingdom. The rebellion had become a regime. The establishment of Tianjin changed everything. A movement on the march now had a capital, court, bureaucracy, ceremonial life, treasury, and urban base. It could issue decrees, manage appointments, and project itself as more than an insurgent army. But a capital also creates new problems. It brings luxury, faction, jealousy, and distance from the rough egalitarian energies that helped power the movement in its earlier years. It requires administration at scale. It requires provisions. It attracts opportunists. It makes succession, access, and hierarchy matters of palace conflict rather than only battlefield necessity. Revolutionary capitals often reveal the gap between prophetic promise and institutional capacity. Tianjin would do so in blood. At first, however, the city radiated possibility. The Taiping leadership tried to order life according to the principles of the heavenly kingdom. Property arrangements, worship practices, moral regulations, and gender separation were imposed in varying forms, and with varying degrees of actual enforcement. The movement's great social program, later associated with documents such as the land system of the Heavenly Dynasty, promised a world in which land would be held and distributed according to household need in divine order rather than entrenched local inequity. It envisioned an egalitarian restructuring under heaven. Whether this vision could ever have been fully realized is another matter. Revolutionary programs are often clearest on paper precisely where reality resists them most. But as a statement of ambition, it mattered immensely. The Taiping were not just trying to replace one dynasty with another. They were trying to reorder society. To many observers, this mixture of radical social promise and severe moral discipline was profoundly unsettling. Women in the movement could in some cases occupy more visible positions than under conventional Qing norms, and foot-binding was denounced. Yet the same kingdom enforced harsh segregation and regulation. It condemned one hierarchy while reproducing another. It preached equality before heaven while concentrating power around sacred rulers. It railed against corruption while generating new privileges at court. These contradictions did not weaken it immediately. In fact, many great revolutionary movements are strongest while contradiction is still explained away as temporary necessity. But contradiction accumulates interest, and the bill eventually comes due. To understand the Taiping Heavenly Kingdom, it is not enough to say that it was radical, millenarian, or proto-modern. It was all of those things in part, and none of them entirely. It was a moral regime that sought to police private life at a depth most dynasties never attempted. It was an anti-idolatrous movement that smashed temples, denounced Confucian rites, and treated much of the inherited religious world of China as demonic corruption. It was a political kingdom that borrowed from imperial habits even while denouncing the empire. It was a court of revelation trying to govern millions. Its social rules were famously severe. Men and women were often housed separately. Sexual conduct was heavily regulated. Opium, alcohol, gambling, tobacco, and forms of entertainment associated with moral decay were condemned. Hairstyles and dress could become signs of allegiance. Idols were broken. Sacred books and proclamations circulated. Administratively, the kingdom tried to create military civil units through which households, labor, discipline, and resources could be managed in a more ordered and divinely sanctioned way. The aim was not just obedience. It was purification. The movement's critique of Confucianism was especially startling. Confucian orthodoxy had long provided the moral and intellectual grammar of governance. The imperial examination system rested on it. Bureaucratic legitimacy rested on it. Social hierarchy and ritual life rested on it. Hong Xiuquan's movement treated large parts of this tradition as false and corrupt. In doing so, it attacked not just the dynasty but the civilizational language through which educated society understood itself. This helps explain both the attraction and the fury the movement inspired. To marginal people and disaffected believers, the attack could feel liberating. To many literati and officials, it felt like barbarism wearing revelation as a mask. The anti-Manchu language of the movement likewise bound ethnic politics to sacred war. Qing rule had long involved a complex coexistence of Manchu imperial institutions and Han elite collaboration. The Taiping simplified this complexity into a narrative of demonic foreign oppression. Such simplification can be politically powerful because it offers moral clarity to people living inside more ambiguous realities. But it also encourages exterminatory logic. If rulers are demons, compromise becomes contamination. The massacres that marked Taiping expansion were therefore not accidental byproducts of chaotic war. They were often tied to the movement's moral categories. And yet it would be wrong to think of the kingdom merely as pure destruction. It also attracted sincere reformist hope. The promise of more equal access to land, the condemnation of opium, the attack on corruption, the limited openings for women within a harshly structured order, and the vision of a morally remade society all had genuine appeal. The Taiping Kingdom was a vehicle for desperate aspiration as much as for terror. That is one reason it lasted as long as it did. Millions do not endure immense hardship for a cause they experience only as coercion. They endure because coercion is braided with faith, grievance, belonging, and the conviction that the present order is intolerable. From the court in Tianjin, however, the very features that had given the movement its force began to complicate governance. Revelation is a difficult principle of administration. If authority rests on heavenly inspiration, how are disputes settled? If one king can claim to speak with the voice of God, what checks him? If sacred hierarchy is more than symbolic, what prevents the court from becoming a chamber of divine rivalry? These were not abstract concerns. They defined the internal life of the Taiping state. Yang Xiuqing's rise epitomized the danger. As the Eastern king, he claimed to speak with the voice of God the Father during states of spirit possession. These performances or visitations gave him enormous authority. He could rebuke others, including the heavenly king himself. In a conventional monarchy, such a claim would have been impossible. In a millenarian kingdom built on revelation, it could become central. The question was whether Hong Xiuquan had created a sacred monarchy broad enough to contain a prophet beside him. The answer, eventually, would be no. In the first flush of success, the Taiping leadership confronted a strategic question that every revolutionary state faces once it captures a major center: consolidate or expand further before enemies recover. The answer they chose was, in effect, both. From Tianjin, they launched ambitious military campaigns intended to destroy the Qing in the north, secure the Middle Yangtze and its surrounding provinces, and extend the heavenly kingdom's writ across the empire. In theory, the strategy made sense. The Qing were shaken. Momentum was precious. Delay could allow the court to gather strength. In practice, however, the campaigns exposed how difficult it was to translate early revolutionary speed into durable empire-wide conquest. The Northern expedition pushed toward the old political heartlands and, ultimately, toward Beijing itself. If successful, it could have ended the dynasty by direct assault on the imperial center. But the expedition was overextended almost from the beginning. Long supply lines, hostile terrain, uncertain local support, and the difficulty of coordinating far-flung armies without a mature state apparatus all compounded. Victories proved difficult to convert into stable administration. Revolutionary armies can move quickly when fed by enthusiasm and shock. Holding and governing what they pass through requires another kind of capacity. At the same time, Western expeditions sought to secure the Middle Yangtze and expand the kingdom's hold over strategic zones. These campaigns had mixed results and in some areas considerable success, especially in the middle reaches of the river system. They mattered because control of the Yangtze was not merely geographic. It was economic and political. Grain, transport, communication, and urban life all moved along those waterways. A kingdom that controlled the river could sustain itself. One that lost the river would slowly choke. During these years, the Taiping movement still looked, from many vantage points, frighteningly viable. The Qing could not simply smash it with existing institutions. The old banner and green standard forces had repeatedly shown their limitations. Local officials were outclassed or terrified. Entire regions had to reckon with the Taiping as a lived reality. The court in Beijing could not treat the heavenly kingdom as a regional irritation. It was now a rival state whose success would mean the end of Qing rule. Foreign observers watched with uncertainty. Missionaries were intrigued by the movement's use of Christian language, but soon disturbed by its theological deviations. Western merchants and consuls wanted stability, trade, and secure port conditions more than they wanted to adjudicate which Chinese regime was more legitimate. Some early observers wondered whether the Taiping might become useful partners, or at least whether they represented a new China closer to forms the West could understand. Others quickly recognized that the movement's theology, discipline, and violence were too unfamiliar, too unstable, and too threatening to fit easy categories. The Taiping were Christian in vocabulary only if one ignored how much they had transformed the faith into a distinct revelation centered on Hong himself. Meanwhile, inside Tianjin, the costs of sacred monarchy deepened. Success had produced a court, and a court produced protocol, distance, luxury, and dangerous ambitions. Hong Xiuquan, once the wandering failed candidate turned apocalyptic leader, increasingly withdrew into a more elevated and secluded role. Others around him managed administration and command with varying degrees of competence and personal rivalry. Yang Xiuqing's power grew. So did suspicion. The court that had promised heavenly clarity became a world of intrigue sharpened by the fact that any political conflict could be interpreted as a struggle over divine authority. The kingdom's very language made compromise hard. How do you negotiate office with a man who claims to channel God? How do you restrain a king who believes heaven has chosen him uniquely? How do you maintain collective leadership when each successful commander acquires both troops and a sacred title? These are problems familiar to many revolutionary states, but the Taiping case was intensified by its millenarian structure. The state was a prophecy with armies. The longer it lasted, the more expensive its contradictions became. The great internal rupture came in 1856 in what is often called the Tianjin Incident, and it was one of the decisive catastrophes of the rebellion. By then, the Taiping state had survived long enough for factional distrust to fester into mortal danger. Yang Xiuqing, the Eastern king, had accumulated enormous authority through military success, court influence, and his claims to speak with divine voice. To some he looked indispensable. To others he looked intolerably close to replacing the heavenly king in all but name. Sacred politics had generated a sacred rival. What happened next was a bloodbath of revolutionary self-destruction. Hong Xiuquan, fearful of Yang's power, conspired with other leaders against him. Yang was murdered. Then the killing widened. Wei Chonghui and others slaughtered not only Yang, but many of his followers and associates. Retaliation, panic, and renewed executions followed. Shi Dakai, one of the most capable Taiping leaders, was horrified by the massacre and eventually broke with the court. The incident tore apart trust at the center of the movement. It was not a minor palace scandal. It was a near-cannibalistic implosion of the regime's upper ranks. The Tianjin incident mattered on several levels at once. Militarily, it removed experienced leaders and disrupted command coherence. Politically, it revealed that the heavenly kingdom could not manage succession, hierarchy, or divine rivalry without turning inward with murderous force. Morally, it shattered the movement's claim to stand above the corrupt violence of the old order. If the kingdom of great peace resolved its highest disputes through massacre, what exactly distinguished it from the demonic world it claimed to replace? For followers far from the capital, the effect was not always immediate. Armies still marched. Local authorities still functioned. But the center had been poisoned. Hong Xiuquan survived the crisis, but survival is not the same as recovery. In the years after Tianjin, he became more secluded, more reliant on kin, more detached from the practical burdens of campaign management, and in some respects more imprisoned by his own sacrality. A revolutionary founder can remain symbolically indispensable even while becoming administratively weak. That is what happened to Hong. The heavenly king still mattered enormously as a source of legitimacy, but the movement increasingly lacked the disciplined political center it would have needed to turn conquest into durable statehood. Shi Dakai's departure was especially damaging. He had real military talent and a reputation broad enough to matter. His break with Tianjin was not merely one commander leaving another. It was evidence that the most capable men in the movement could no longer trust the court's moral or political core. Shi Dakai would continue to fight independently for years, becoming a kind of wandering revolutionary warlord with a following and a legend of his own, before eventual capture and death. His path after Tianjin mirrored a broader truth about the late Taiping period. The rebellion increasingly fragmented into zones of military power and mobile charisma, even while the heavenly kingdom still claimed universal sovereignty. The self-destruction at Tianjin also gave the Qing something they badly needed: time. Before 1856, the Taiping had often seemed to expand faster than the dynasty could adapt. After Tianjin, the balance of adaptation began to shift. The Qing still faced a colossal threat, but the threat was no longer unified in the same way. Internal terror had done part of the dynasty's work for it. The Qing response to the Taiping challenge eventually succeeded not because the old imperial military machine suddenly discovered hidden excellence, but because the state adapted through decentralization, local elite mobilization, and new military forms. The traditional banner forces and green standard troops had repeatedly failed to contain the rebellion. They were often underfunded, poorly commanded, or demoralized. The dynasty's survival, therefore, came increasingly to depend on forces raised outside the old central structures, especially the regional armies organized by scholar officials and local gentry. No figure is more central to this transformation than Zheng Guofan. A Hunan scholar official of deep Confucian conviction, Zheng was not originally a military celebrity. He became one because the crisis demanded a type of loyalist power the old state could no longer provide on its own. In Hunan, he began organizing militia and then more substantial regional forces, drawing on local gentry networks, moral authority, personal patronage, and the shared fear that the Taiping represented not merely a rebellion but civilizational disorder. These forces became known as the Xiong Army. The Xiong Army differed from the older imperial forces in ways that would shape Chinese politics long after the Taiping War ended. It was bound more by personal ties, provincial identity, and direct loyalty to commanders than by abstract bureaucratic routine. It relied on local funding and gentry support. It fused military mobilization with moral discourse. Zheng framed the struggle not simply as dynastic service, but as the defense of Confucian civilization against a heterodox and destructive enemy. This mattered because it allowed local elites to see military action as a moral duty, not merely an imperial command. Zheng Guofan was not alone. Li Hongzhang and others would later build or command related forces, and the pattern of provincial militarization spread. But Zheng's example was foundational. The Qing, in effect, survived by outsourcing part of its own reconquest to men whose power rested increasingly on local and personal bases. This was both salvation and long-term danger. It helped defeat the Taiping. It also weakened the old monopoly of central military authority and taught later Chinese politics that in moments of crisis, strongmen rooted in province, army, and personal network could become more decisive than the formal machinery of the state. Zheng's methods were deliberate, patient, and often grim. He did not promise sudden salvation. He built, trained, disciplined, and slowly advanced. He paid close attention to logistics, grain, transport, fortification, and the securing of river routes. He also presided over forces capable of immense cruelty. The reconquest of Taiping territory was not a humanitarian campaign. It was a civil war within a vast empire, fought with massacres, sieges, burnings, reprisal killings, and the moral language of total struggle. Qing loyalism and Confucian order did not arrive gently. They arrived behind armies prepared to destroy cities in order to save the dynasty. This is one of the hardest truths about the Taiping Rebellion. There was no innocent side. The Qing state fought to survive, but it survived through methods that spread devastation across central China. The Taiping promised heavenly peace, but they built their kingdom through conquest, massacre, and coercion. Civilian populations caught between these forces endured famine, displacement, execution, recruitment, disease, and the collapse of ordinary life. The death toll of the war is so large in part because the conflict was not confined to battlefields. It consumed the infrastructures of survival themselves: harvests, granaries, canals, roads, markets, and households. Zheng's rise also marked a clash of moral universes. On one side stood the Taiping claim that heaven demanded radical purification and dynastic overthrow. On the other stood Zheng's conviction that the inherited Confucian order, however imperfect, remained the only viable basis for civilization. To him, the Taiping were not misguided reformers, but destroyers of the moral foundations of Chinese life. This is why the loyalist struggle became so intense. It was not just a military campaign. It was a counter-revolution in the name of restoring order, ritual, hierarchy, and cultural continuity. To grasp the scale of the Taiping Rebellion, one must leave the courts and commanders and look at what happened to the land and the people living on it. The war moved through some of the richest and most densely settled parts of China. The lower and middle Yangtze regions were not empty battlefields. They were networks of farms, market towns, lineage compounds, dikes, canals, warehouses, shrines, workshops, ferries, and cities whose prosperity depended on the uninterrupted movement of grain, people, and credit. Once war entered this system, destruction could multiply with terrible speed. Armies ate first. They also requisitioned transport, animals, metal, timber, labor, and shelter. Fields went untilled because the men were dead, conscripted, fled, or unwilling to work under threat. Irrigation works were neglected or damaged. Granaries were seized or burned. Merchants could not move goods safely. Famine followed not only from harvest failure, but from the collapse of the commercial systems that usually redistributed grain. Epidemics found easy ground among refugees, besieged cities, and exhausted populations. A civil war of this kind kills indirectly on a scale battlefield statistics alone cannot capture. Cities became traps as often as strongholds. Sieges could last months. Food vanished. Prices climbed beyond reason. Civilians ate what should never be eaten. Families sold possessions, then roofs, then timbers, then the future. Disease moved through cramped quarters. When walls finally fell, massacre was common. Conquerors suspected collaboration, hid behind ideology, or simply used terror to make examples. The war was so immense that whole local social worlds could disappear almost without leaving names that later history remembered. Refugee movement became one of the defining realities of the era. People fled approaching armies, or fled after armies passed, or fled because nearby towns had collapsed economically even if battle had not yet reached them. Some moved by river, some on foot, some with carts, some with almost nothing at all. The roads and waterways of central China carried not just troops, but human wreckage. A rebellion on this scale does not simply rearrange political power. It rearranges where life can be lived. Entire regions could become empty of ordinary cultivation and crowded instead with wandering people, armed bands, and the administrative debris of lost authority. This human devastation is one reason estimates of the death toll vary so widely, and yet all remain staggering. Historians debate the numbers because the war's mortality came through many channels: massacre, battle, disease, famine, displacement, and long-term demographic collapse. Whether one says 20 million, or more, or less, the essential truth remains the same. The Taiping Rebellion belongs in the company of the deadliest conflicts in human history. Not because modern states deployed machine weapons, but because a densely populated agrarian society was ripped apart in its productive and administrative core. The moral languages of the conflict intensified suffering. Taiping forces could describe opponents as demons, idolaters, or defenders of a corrupt dynasty. Qing loyalists could describe Taipings as heterodox monsters destroying civilization itself. Once war is narrated in those terms, civilians living under the wrong side become easier to treat as contaminated, suspect, or expendable. A market town becomes not merely a place to seize, but a nest of moral corruption. A city becomes not merely a strategic objective, but a symbol to be purged. Such rhetoric does not create cruelty from nothing, but it grants cruelty a sacred and political justification. The devastation also altered elite psychology. Scholar gentry families who had once assumed that order, however strained, would basically began to see how quickly order could disappear. That experience mattered. It made conservative reconstruction more urgent. It made local defense more acceptable. It made later reform discourse more practical and less abstract. Once one has seen counties emptied, cities burned, granaries looted, and lineages uprooted, the state ceases to be a distant moral structure and becomes instead the fragile difference between civilization and collapse. All of this is why the Taiping War cannot be told only as a battle between Han Xiuquan and the Qing throne. It was also a war between competing capacities to keep daily life functioning. On that measure, both sides often failed catastrophically. But the side that ultimately prevailed would be the side more able, however brutally, to restore roads, tax flows, grain movement, and local confidence. States survive not only when they defeat enemies in battle, but when enough people come to believe that under them life can once again become ordinary. The foreign powers hovering on the edges of this conflict were never mere spectators, though they did not control its logic either. Britain, France, the United States, missionaries, merchants, treaty port communities, and military advisors all had reasons to watch events closely. They had treaty rights to protect, commercial interests to secure, missionary hopes to test, and political anxieties about what a collapsing China might mean for the wider balance of trade and diplomacy. Yet their relationship to the Taiping was complicated from the start. Some missionaries initially wondered whether the Taiping movement represented, however distorted, a Christian awakening inside China. The movement's denunciation of idols, its use of biblical language, and its claims about God and Jesus understandably drew attention. But closer examination produced deep alarm. The theology of Han Xiuquan was neither orthodox nor stable by missionary standards. His claim to be the younger brother of Jesus, the movement's revelation-based authority structure, and its severe, often bizarre reinterpretations of Scripture made many missionaries recoil. What at first looked like a possible evangelical opening increasingly resembled a dangerous heresy tied to mass violence. Merchants and diplomats had another set of calculations. They wanted secure trade, particularly around the treaty ports and the lower Yangtze. They were less interested in the moral quality of the Taiping than in whether the movement would disrupt commerce, threaten treaty rights, or destabilize cities such as Shanghai. At different points, foreign observers tried caution, ambiguity, exploratory contact, or limited neutrality. But as the war intensified around economically vital zones, neutrality became harder to sustain. Shanghai was especially important. It was commercially vital, increasingly connected to foreign interests, and strategically positioned within the wider war. If Taiping expansion swallowed the city or permanently destabilized its hinterland, foreign merchants and governments would face direct losses. This pushed Western involvement toward a more practical alignment with the Qing, not out of affection for the dynasty, but because the Qing increasingly looked like the less disruptive framework for preserving trade and order. Out of this environment emerged one of the war's more famous auxiliary forces, the ever-victorious army. Though the details and command history are more complicated than popular memory sometimes allows, the general pattern is clear. Western officers and methods, local soldiers, and Qing-aligned objectives combined to create a force capable of defending key areas against Taiping attack. Frederick Townsend Ward played a major early role. Later, Charles George Gordon became the foreign officer most associated with the army in Western memory. The force was never the main engine of Qing victory, but it mattered symbolically and operationally in defending zones around Shanghai and supporting local anti-Taiping campaigns. The use of foreign officers and tactics in a Chinese civil war reveals much about the mid-19th century world. The Qing state that had once confronted the West from a position of imperial superiority now accepted or tolerated forms of foreign military assistance when its own survival was at stake. At the same time, foreign powers discovered that intervention in China need not mean total conquest to be consequential. Limited alignment, advisory roles, and strategic local support could influence outcomes while preserving the treaty port order from which they benefited. Yet foreign involvement should not be exaggerated into the decisive cause of Taiping defeat. The rebellion rose and was broken primarily through Chinese forces, Chinese political decisions, Chinese social fractures, and Chinese regional armies. The ever-victorious army and allied foreign interventions were real, but they operated within a war whose scale dwarfed them. The decisive story remained the contest between the Taiping state and the Qing loyalist reconstruction led by provincial commanders such as Xing Guofan and Li Hongzhang. What foreign involvement did do was help shape the future. It increased the prestige of certain forms of military modernization. It reinforced the practical lesson that Western arms, training, and industrial techniques mattered. It further bound Qing's survival to a world of unequal engagement with foreign power. And it helped establish a pattern that would recur. Internal Chinese crises becoming occasions for foreign actors to intervene selectively under the language of order, trade, or civilization. The Taiping War was therefore not only a Chinese civil war. It was also part of the larger 19th century story in which empires, missions, commerce, and local collapse increasingly overlapped. As the late 1850s turned into the early 1860s, the strategic balance shifted steadily against the Taiping. The reasons were cumulative. Tianjing's internal bloodletting had weakened central leadership. The kingdom still possessed armies and territory, but its coherence had declined. Meanwhile, the Qing side had become more competent precisely where it had once seemed weakest: provincial armies, transport control, local financing, and disciplined reconquest. The war entered a harder, slower phase in which logistics, river control, and methodical siegecraft mattered more than initial prophetic momentum. Xing Guofan understood the importance of patience. He has often been described as deliberate to the point of slowness, but in a war of this scale, slowness could be strategy. Rather than gambling on reckless offensives, he focused on securing lines, consolidating positions, taking key river cities, and steadily strangling the Taiping state. The Yangtze Basin was the crucial theater. Whoever controlled it could feed armies, move resources, and sustain administration. This is why cities like Anqing mattered so much. They were not merely local prizes. They were valves in the circulatory system of the war. The siege and fall of Anqing in 1861 was one of the conflict's decisive episodes. As a major Taiping stronghold on the Yangtze, it was central to the defense of Tianjin. Zheng's forces encircled it methodically, cutting supply and tightening pressure over time. Famine took hold. Relief attempts failed. The city's eventual fall was catastrophic for the Taiping because it exposed how badly their ability to protect vital nodes had deteriorated. Once Anqing was gone, the road toward the final isolation of the heavenly capital grew clearer. Li Hongzhang, another major loyalist commander and later statesman, emerged as a key figure in this phase as well. Like Zheng, he represented a type of provincial military power that the crisis had brought into prominence. His Hui army would become one of the major forces in the reconquest and in later Qing efforts at reform and self-strengthening. Here again, the war's long-term political significance becomes visible. The rebellion did not only devastate China, it changed which men and which institutions mattered in China. The dynasty survived, but it survived by empowering figures and forms of military organization that would reshape the empire's future. On the Taiping side, military talent still existed. Li Xiuqing, often known as the Loyal King, was one of the most capable commanders of the later period. He mounted significant campaigns, sought to relieve pressure, and in some respects represented the possibility that the movement might still recover operational flexibility even as the court decayed. But talent at the front could not fully compensate for structural weakness at the center. A revolutionary state can survive battlefield losses if its political core remains credible. It rarely survives for long once battlefield strain combines with a disordered capital, narrowing resources, and factional rot. This period also reveals the changing emotional atmosphere of the war. Earlier, the Taiping had often seemed like a force of expansion, unpredictability, and terrible promise. By the early 1860s, in many regions, they increasingly looked besieged, strained, and defensive. This did not make them harmless. Far from it. Their armies could still fight hard, devastate territory, and terrify opponents. But the larger arc had begun to bend. The heavenly future that once seemed to be racing outward from Nanjing was now increasingly compressed behind walls, proclamations, and increasingly desperate claims that victory remained ordained. The Qing, by contrast, no longer appeared merely reactive. The dynasty's court in Beijing still lived with fear and administrative strain, but the loyalist reconquest had given the regime a new political grammar: survival through local strength, moral reconstruction, and practical adaptation. The state that emerged from this war would not be the confident 18th century Qing. It would be a more brittle, more militarized, more regionally dependent order. But it would still be the Qing. And by the early 1860s, that fact was beginning to look possible again. While the war tightened around the lower Yangtze, Hong Xiuquan's own position grew stranger. Founders of revolutionary kingdoms often become less accessible as their regimes mature, but Hong's withdrawal had a particularly damaging quality. He had always been more than a commander. He was the source of the movement's cosmology. Yet as the war worsened and the demands of practical governance intensified, he increasingly retreated into a sacralized isolation that made it harder for him to respond flexibly to military and administrative reality. Accounts of Hong in the later years of the Heavenly Kingdom suggest a ruler who still believed absolutely in his divine mission, yet was increasingly removed from the practical details that determined whether the kingdom could survive. He issued proclamations, interpreted events through revelation, and relied on family members and court circles whose competence varied. Reports of odd dietary recommendations, scriptural fixation, and elevated remoteness circulated among both enemies and later commentators. Some of these accounts may reflect hostile interpretation, but even allowing for distortion, the broader truth remains. By the final phase of the war, the Heavenly King was less a field-making revolutionary leader than a secluded sacred sovereign presiding over a kingdom under siege. This mattered because charismatic legitimacy must be renewed by success. A prophet can survive failed expectations for a time if followers believe the failure has a hidden meaning. But a besieged capital, shrinking territory, famine, and administrative breakdown place immense strain on such belief. The more the outer world contradicted the promise of heavenly triumph, the more the leadership needed either strategic adaptation or renewed revelation powerful enough to absorb contradiction. Hong's later court did not produce enough of the former and relied too heavily on the latter. The city of Tianjin itself embodied this decline. Once the symbol of revolutionary possibility, it increasingly became a trapped center. Supplies tightened. Surrounding territory could no longer guarantee relief. Qing pressure constricted movement and resources. The city's social life changed under scarcity. What had been a capital now became a fortress waiting under judgment. In revolutionary history, this is a recognizable and tragic moment. Capitals built as proofs of a new age become prisons of their own claim. They cannot easily retreat because their symbolic function requires endurance. Yet endurance without replenishment becomes starvation. The role of kin and palace networks grew correspondingly. When founders lose trusted comrades through purge, death, or fracture, they often turn to family. That can preserve loyalty, but it can also narrow the state into something less capable and more enclosed. The Taiping court in its last years showed these features. Administrative seriousness still existed in parts of the system, especially among military commanders at the front, but the capital was not the disciplined engine it would have needed to be. It was a sacred court under siege, more convinced of its mandate than able to sustain its world. One should not mock Hong for this. The scale of the pressures on him was extraordinary. He had gone from failed examination candidate to founder of a rival dynasty ruling one of China's great cities. He had watched lieutenants become kings, then traitors, then corpses. He had seen the movement expand with impossible speed and then harden into attrition. His psychological world was built from revelation, and revelation rarely encourages self-doubt of the kind bureaucratic survival requires. The same absolute confidence that allowed Hong to create the Taiping Kingdom made it hard for him to adapt once heaven seemed to demand persistence, but reality demanded reinvention. That tension between prophetic certainty and strategic flexibility is one of the deepest explanatory keys to the rebellion. The Taiping did not fail because they lacked belief. They failed in part because they had so much belief that when contradiction accumulated, the center could not transform itself without betraying the very basis of its own authority. Secular states can adjust policy and claim prudence. A heavenly kingdom that changes too much risks admitting that heaven may have been wrong. By the time Tianjin faced its final siege, this trap had nearly closed. The final siege of Nanjing, or Tianjin, was the climax toward which the war had long been moving. Zheng Guofan's forces, alongside other loyalist armies, closed in with the deliberate confidence of men who believed that time now favored them. The city was large, heavily fortified, and symbolically immense. It could not be stormed lightly, but it could be isolated, starved, battered, mined, and eventually broken. Siege warfare on this scale is not a single event. It is a process of compression. Food contracts, disease spreads, morale fractures, hopes of relief thin, rumor becomes a weapon. Every day the walls still stand costs the defenders something they may not recover. Inside the city, conditions deteriorated. Accounts describe shortages severe enough to drive people to eat roots, leaves, and whatever could be found. The heavenly capital, once the proud seat of an alternative order, became a place where ordinary survival consumed attention. Hong Xiuquan himself died in 1864 before the city finally fell. The circumstances remain debated in detail, but the broad reality is unmistakable. The founder of the heavenly kingdom did not ride out in triumphant revelation or die at the head of a victorious host. He died inside a starving capital while the world he had announced closed in on itself. His death did not save the city, nor did it end the symbolic threat his movement had posed, but it marked the final collapse of the center. Leadership passed in name to Hong's teenage son, an act revealing both dynastic reflex and terminal weakness. A millenarian kingdom born in anti-dynastic prophecy had become, in effect, a hereditary emergency under siege. There was no time for orderly succession, no chance for legitimacy to ripen around the new figure. The city had become a shell holding the remains of a claim. When Qing forces finally breached Nanjing in July 1864, the fall was catastrophic. Street fighting erupted. Fire spread. Mass killing followed. The reconquest of the city was not a polite transfer of sovereignty. It was a civil war ending in vengeance, slaughter, and eradication. Surviving Taiping defenders were hunted. Civilians were caught in the same furnace. The heavenly capital, once the seat of an alternative future, was consumed as both strategic objective and moral warning. In the eyes of the Qing victors, this was not merely a military success. It was the extirpation of a heterodox and world-upending menace. The destruction of Nanjing was so vast that later memory often struggles to hold it in scale. This was one of the great cities of China, and it emerged from the war scarred, depopulated, and transformed. The fall of the city symbolized more than the end of one regime. It symbolized the closing of a possibility that had once seemed able to swallow the empire. A rival heaven had been broken on earth. Yet even after Nanjing fell, violence did not simply cease. Taiping remnants and related forces continued resistance in different regions. Warfare blended into suppression, pursuit, mopping up operations, and overlapping rebellions that complicated the Qing recovery. But the center of the heavenly kingdom was gone, and with it the last plausible basis for imagining a Taiping state that might still outlive the dynasty. The Qing court had survived the worst internal threat it had yet faced in the 19th century. But it did not survive unchanged. It survived through regional armies, gentry militarization, and brutal reconquest. It survived through men like Zheng Guofan, whose loyalty restored the dynasty, while also teaching China that provincial military power could become the practical foundation of imperial continuity. The victory was therefore real, but it carried future costs folded inside it. The dynasty had saved itself by becoming something different from what it had once been. The emotional resonance of the fall also matters. For Taiping believers, the loss of Tianjin was not merely the fall of a city. It was the collapse of a sacred geography. For Qing loyalists, it was the restoration of a moral world, however damaged. For the civilians who had endured the siege, it was often simply the end of one terror and the beginning of another. For historians, the fall of Nanjing in 1864 is the point at which the rebellion becomes legible as failure. But for people inside the event, failure came not as abstraction. It came as hunger, smoke, breach, pursuit, and the knowledge that the old world, though wounded, had outlasted the kingdom that promised to replace it. After the fall of Tianjin, Qing reconquest moved into a grim afterlife of pursuit, pacification, and reconstruction. Remnant Taiping forces continued fighting in scattered zones, and other rebellions, including the Nian in the north and Muslim uprisings elsewhere in the empire, ensured that the dynasty's crisis was far from over. The mid-19th century in China was not a single rebellion punctuating an otherwise stable order. It was a long period in which multiple insurgencies, foreign wars, fiscal strains, and administrative experiments overlapped. The Taiping War was the largest of these upheavals, but it was also part of a wider age of unraveling. In practical terms, reconquest required more than victory. It required reoccupation, taxation, legal re-establishment, grain movement, local office reconstruction, and some restoration of trust. These tasks could take years. Fields had to be reclaimed, irrigation repaired, populations resettled or at least counted. Gentry lineages had to decide whether to invest again in places that had become killing grounds. Magistrates had to rule counties whose archives, granaries, and social hierarchies had been wrecked. Reconstruction is one of the least dramatic and most decisive forms of political labor, and after the Taiping War, it was colossal. The Qing dynasty's later 19th century reform efforts cannot be understood apart from this trauma. The self-strengthening movement, with its interest in arsenals, shipyards, translation, limited institutional borrowing from the West, and new military-industrial capacities, emerged from a world in which the dynasty had learned how vulnerable it was. Officials like Zheng Guofan and Li Hongzhang became associated not only with loyalist victory, but with the recognition that China could not simply resume its old confidence unchanged. The empire had survived foreign war and internal apocalypse, but survival had stripped away illusions. At the same time, the war deepened provincialism in modern Chinese politics. Regional armies had saved the dynasty, but armies built through personal and provincial networks do not disappear harmlessly back into abstraction. Commanders gained prestige and patronage. Provincial elites learned that the center could fail and that local mobilization might be the difference between order and ruin. This did not immediately destroy the Qing, but it changed the balance of political imagination. The empire was now more dependent on regional strongmen, and that dependence would echo into the final collapse of the dynasty and the warlord politics of the early republic. The war also transformed the relationship between Chinese society and Christianity, or rather what many Chinese understood Christianity to be. The Taiping had appropriated Christian language in a revolutionary, heterodox, and often terrifying way. For missionaries, this was a disaster of misunderstanding. For many Chinese observers, the line between missionary teaching, foreign intrusion, and Taiping ideology could be confusing or politically charged even when theological distinctions were clear to outsiders. The rebellion therefore complicated the social position of Christianity in China, making it part of a wider 19th century story of fascination, suspicion, translation, and imperial entanglement. For local communities, however, such broad narratives often mattered less than survival. Memory after the Taiping War was uneven. Some places preserved stories of massacre, flight, and resistance with intense local specificity. Others folded the trauma into lineage histories, temple reconstructions, or county gazetteers. Some survivors try not to speak at all. The greater the catastrophe, the more likely it is that memory fragments. Grand historians search for total meaning. Families often remember only which ancestor vanished, which village burned, which road was impassable, which year the fields went empty. This unevenness helps explain why the Taiping Rebellion is less globally famous than its scale would suggest. It lacks, for many outside China, the simple visual symbols that later wars acquired. It sits awkwardly between categories, not exactly anti-colonial in the familiar 20th century sense, not simply a peasant revolt, not easily classifiable as nationalism, religion, or proto-social revolution alone. Its theology seems strange to secular readers. Its geography is enormous and unfamiliar to those trained on European chronology. And its death toll, so vast as to be almost unbelievable, can produce numbness rather than recognition. Yet if one cares about the making of the modern world, it cannot be left at the margins. It belongs near the center. One of the most revealing ways to measure the Taiping Rebellion is to ask what later generations in China learned from it. Even when they disagreed about what exactly had happened, conservatives learned that heterodox mass mobilization could produce civilizational disaster. Reformers learned that the dynasty's institutional complacency had nearly killed the empire. Revolutionaries learned that dynasties could, in fact, be challenged by vast internal movements speaking in alternative moral languages. Military modernizers learned that old forces were inadequate and that disciplined new armies mattered. Local elites learned that self-defense and provincial mobilization were not optional luxuries. Radical thinkers learned that ideas imported from abroad could be translated, transformed, and turned against the old order in ways no one fully anticipated. Even the Qing victory carried a hidden revolutionary lesson. The dynasty had not triumphed through the serene adequacy of the old system. It had triumphed by improvisation, regional militarization, and adaptation under existential stress. That meant the old order had been validated and discredited at the same time. It survived, but at the cost of proving how much it had failed. Many later Chinese reformers and revolutionaries would inherit precisely that double lesson. Respect for the civilizational depth of the old order combined with contempt for its inability to protect China from internal collapse and foreign aggression. The Taiping also forced a confrontation with the problem of ideology in modern China. It was one of the first great mass movements in China to bind together total moral critique, utopian social vision, anti-dynastic politics, mass mobilization, and territorial conquest in a way that looked startlingly modern even when wrapped in deeply unmodern theology. Later movements, from late Qing reformism to Republican nationalism to communism, would differ profoundly from the Taiping in doctrine, organization, and historical self-understanding. But the basic fact that China could generate continent-shaking movements claiming to remake society from the foundations up was one of the Taiping Rebellion's enduring revelations. This is especially striking when one thinks about the late 19th and early 20th centuries. Chinese revolutionaries of later generations did not simply inherit a placid tradition waiting for European ideas to animate it. They inherited a landscape already scarred by one of the most enormous experiments in millenarian state-building the world had ever seen. The Taiping Kingdom had shown both the power and the peril of trying to reconstruct society through total ideological commitment. It had shown how quickly visions of equality and purification could become engines of coercion. It had shown how armies born from grievance could become states, and how states born from prophecy could devour themselves. The rebellion also altered how foreign observers understood China. Missionaries, soldiers, diplomats, merchants, and later historians confronted a China that was not simply old, static, or closed, as so many lazy stereotypes suggested. It was violently dynamic. It could generate original religious political syntheses. It could implode from internal strain on a scale scarcely imaginable to European publics. It could produce leaders like Hong Xiuquan, Zheng Guofan, and Li Hongzhang, men who could not be understood through simplistic categories of East versus West, tradition versus modernity. The Taiping War exposed China as historically alive in forms many outsiders were ill-equipped to comprehend. Yet even this framing can become too abstract if it loses sight of the human cost. The war was not important only because later thinkers learned lessons from it. It was important because millions lived and died inside it. Children grew up amid flight. Parents buried the unburied. Entire counties had to relearn ordinary life after years of abnormality. Women carried households through absence, widowhood, famine, and danger. Enslaved or bonded labor arrangements shifted under the pressure of war in some regions, while in others old coercions returned with new justifications. Clerks, teachers, ferrymen, monks, merchants, tenants, miners, cooks, and boatmen all found themselves inside a conflict whose causes they had not necessarily shaped, but whose consequences entered every hour of existence. When we ask why the Taiping Rebellion deserves to be remembered, the answer is therefore not only that it was large. Plenty of large events fade in memory when they seem not to belong to later narratives people already know how to tell. The Taiping War deserves remembrance because it reveals, with extraordinary clarity, how a great empire can be broken open by the convergence of social strain, ideological revelation, military weakness, local grievance, and state failure. It reveals how movements that begin by denouncing corruption and oppression can create new violence at the scale of a kingdom. And it reveals how states that survive such upheaval often do so by changing in ways that carry future crises within them. Memory of Hong Xiuquan himself has always been unstable, and that instability is appropriate. Was he a madman, prophet, failed scholar transformed by humiliation, social revolutionary, religious innovator, catastrophic imposter, or tragic visionary? He was, in different proportions, all of these things. To reduce him to madness is too easy, because madness alone does not explain organization, recruitment, military persistence, or the capacity to reshape the political field of an empire. To romanticize him as a misunderstood liberator is equally misleading, because the kingdom he built was violent, coercive, and often internally monstrous. Hong matters because he makes historical explanation uncomfortable. He was neither simply deranged nor simply progressive. He was a visionary whose revelation attached itself to social fracture and became a state. There is something deeply 19th century in this combination. Across the world, the 19th century generated movements that fused religion, nationalism, social grievance, and radical restructuring. But the Taiping case remains singular in scale and texture. Nowhere else did an exam-failed village intellectual, armed with a hybrid reading of Christian doctrine and divine kinship, build a rival heavenly dynasty in one of the largest empires on earth. The improbability is part of the point. History is not governed by probability alone. It is governed by structures, yes, but also by moments when structures become vulnerable to people who can offer certainty where ordinary political life offers only erosion. The attraction of certainty should not be underestimated. Qing China in the first half of the 19th century placed immense burdens on ordinary people while leaving many without persuasive paths to recognition, security, or justice. The Taiping message cut through complexity. It named demons. It named a chosen people, It named a future. It named enemies with total clarity. It named a sacred hierarchy that turned the humiliations of marginal life into the dignity of participation in world remaking struggle. This is a pattern far larger than one rebellion. Movements become powerful when they relieve the burden of ambiguity. They tell followers not merely what is wrong, but who they are in the story of what is wrong. That is also why such movements can become so destructive. If the world is divided between the chosen and the demonic, compromise looks like betrayal. If social suffering has cosmic meaning, then ordinary constraints may seem trivial beside the scale of redemption at stake. If the kingdom to come is morally pure, then violence in the present can be reclassified as necessary cleansing. The Taiping Rebellion reminds us that utopian certainty is not simply hopeful. It is combustible. It can mobilize against real injustice and yet create fresh injustice of extraordinary range. Zheng Guofan, by contrast, has often been remembered as the anti-Taiping exemplar of disciplined conservatism, a Confucian statesman, morally serious, patient, austere, and willing to save civilization by building new power without abandoning old principles. There is truth in that portrait, but it too must be complicated. Zheng saved the dynasty from the Taiping threat, yet he did so by constructing provincial military power and local elite mobilization that altered the old order profoundly. He defended Confucian civilization through adaptation that was, in its own way, revolutionary. His victory therefore belongs not just to restoration, but to transformation. The Qing after Zheng was not the Qing before Zheng. The same may be said of China after the Taiping War. The old world survived, but it survived in altered form. The central state had been weakened and saved. Regional military and elite power had expanded. Foreign involvement had deepened. The legitimacy of inherited structures had been tested more severely than before. The possibility of mass ideological upheaval had been demonstrated beyond denial. The wounds of the war would not all be visible in formal institutions, but they would remain present in memory, local society, and political habit. To tell the Taiping story honestly, then, is to refuse easy moral sorting. The rebellion exposed the Qing dynasty's failures. It also exposed the terror that can enter history when salvation becomes a government. It made clear that state weakness can be as dangerous as state oppression. It showed that reform delayed too long can invite revolution in forms no reformer would welcome. And it proved that, in moments of deep strain, the line between religious revival, social protest, and civil war can become frighteningly thin. Why, then, is the Taiping Rebellion not better known outside China? Part of the answer lies in the geography of historical attention. For many Western publics, the 19th century is still narrated through European revolutions, the American Civil War, industrialization, empire, and the world that leads toward the First World War. China often enters that story only through foreign intrusion, opium, treaty ports, concessions, and later the Boxer Crisis. Internal Chinese history appears as context rather than event, backdrop rather than center. The Taiping Rebellion suffers from that distortion. It is often mentioned, if at all, as one crisis among many in Qing decline, a phrase far too flat to contain what the war actually was. Another reason is narrative discomfort. The rebellion does not fit clean moral templates. It is not easy to package as a straightforward liberation struggle. It is not easy to turn into a simple story of progress. It is too religious for secular comfort, too violent for romantic revolution, too socially radical for conservative nostalgia, and too rooted in Chinese history to be easily swallowed by the familiar West-centric chronology of modernity. It resists simplification, and what resists simplification often gets neglected. Yet historians increasingly recognize that the Taiping Rebellion belongs in any honest global history of the 19th century. Its death toll alone demands attention. Its role in reshaping the Qing state demands attention. Its influence on later reform, regional militarization, and Chinese political possibility demands attention. And its sheer strangeness, if one may call it that, is not a reason to ignore it, but a reason to study it more carefully. Modern history was not made only in factories, parliaments, and European battlefields. It was also made in places where revelation, empire, peasant grievance, translated scripture, and logistical collapse met with catastrophic force. If we widen the lens further, the Taiping War also belongs to a broader 19th century crisis of empires. Across Eurasia, old regimes confronted new pressures: population growth, fiscal strain, commercial disruption, external military challenge, ideological competition, and social groups increasingly unwilling or unable to live under inherited bargains. The Ottoman Empire, the Russian Empire, the Habsburgs, and later the Qing all faced variations of this problem. What makes the Qing case distinctive is the form in which crisis erupted. Rather than a parliamentary revolution or a nationalist war in the European mold, China faced a rival heavenly kingdom that grew out of its own internal fractures while incorporating ideas filtered through global contact. There is something almost unbearable in the scale of this war when one tries to imagine it from ground level. To say millions died is accurate but emotionally thin. Better to imagine county after county where the dead outnumbered the living memory of normal years. Better to imagine markets gone quiet, canals no longer carrying trade, temples broken, fields full of weeds, city gates blackened, lineages extinguished, women carrying children through roads lined with those who had no more strength to continue, soldiers eating food they could scarcely find, clerks trying to preserve records for a state that no longer reached their district, and rumors constantly arriving that the next force, Taiping, Qing, bandit, militia, foreign-trained auxiliary, was on its way. History at that scale is never merely about the leaders, though leaders matter. It is about the destruction of confidence in ordinary time. Before civil war, people know what next month is supposed to look like. After a war like this, the calendar itself changes. Planting, marriage, study, worship, market day, festival, tax season, river traffic, all the repetitions that make a society feel inhabitable, lose their continuity. The Taiping Rebellion was not only a contest for the throne. It was a long interruption of ordinary time in some of the most populous regions of China. This is why, when later generations in China spoke of order, reform, state power, and national survival, they did so in a landscape already haunted by the memory that one internal rupture had nearly ended the dynasty altogether. The Qing court, the self-strengtheners, the late reformers, the revolutionaries of 1911, and even later 20th century political movements all inherited, however indirectly, a China in which the imaginable had been widened by the Taiping War. Once a heavenly kingdom has ruled from Nanjing and millions have died in the attempt to replace the dynasty, political possibility itself no longer looks the same. In the end, the Taiping Rebellion was a war about who had the right to define heaven on earth. The Qing said order, ritual, dynasty, and civilization were inseparable. Hong Xiuquan said heaven had judged that world corrupt beyond repair. Millions were forced to live inside the collision. The result was not the triumph of utopia or the simple restoration of what had existed before. It was a brutal remaking of China through fire, revelation, siege, famine, and adaptation. The dynasty survived, but survival was not innocence. The loyalist armies that saved the Qing changed the balance of power within the empire. The self-strengthening efforts that followed acknowledged weakness the court could no longer hide. Foreign powers learned how deeply internal Chinese crises could intersect with their own interests. Chinese reformers and revolutionaries learned that the state could be shaken at its roots. Local society learned that the center could fail and that recovery might depend on networks closer to home. And the dead, though often unnamed in broad histories, left behind the negative space in which all later 19th century Chinese politics would move. There is a temptation, when looking back at catastrophes of this scale, to ask whether the rebellion was worth it, whether any of its aims justified the suffering, whether it accomplished anything beyond destruction. The question is understandable and perhaps unavoidable, but history rarely answers such questions cleanly. The Taiping War exposed real injustices and state failures. It also magnified suffering beyond measure. It opened radical possibilities and demonstrated radical dangers. It was at once a protest against an order that no longer worked for millions and a terrifying preview of what can happen when redemption becomes a military government. That is why the Taiping Rebellion remains unfinished in historical meaning. Conservatives can read it as a warning against heterodoxy and social breakdown. Radicals can read it as evidence that ordinary people will follow revolutionary visions when old structures become intolerable. Students of religion can see how revelation travels, mutates, and acquires political force. Students of statecraft can see how empires survive by adapting through institutions they may later struggle to control. Students of human suffering can see, in almost unbearable concentration, how civil war consumes not only armies and rulers, but the ordinary conditions of life. And so the war endures in the historical imagination, not because it produced a lasting heavenly kingdom, but because it revealed how fragile great orders become when strain, belief, and violence converge. It revealed a China already modern in one terrible sense, capable of mass ideological mobilization, administrative improvisation, provincial militarization, and social destruction on a scale that anticipates later ages. It revealed that the 19th century would not belong only to the confident empires that thought they were remaking the world. It would also belong to the peoples inside those empires who, under enough pressure, would try to remake heaven itself. If the Taiping Rebellion is still too little known, that is not because it was small. It is because it was too large, too strange, too morally difficult, and too central to a history many people were never taught to see in full. But once seen, it is impossible to forget. A failed scholar dreams of heaven. A kingdom rises in the south. Nanjing becomes a heavenly capital. An empire nearly loses itself. Regional armies save it and change it. Millions disappear into the violence. And modern China steps out of the wreckage, altered forever. That is the scale of the Taiping Rebellion. Not a footnote. Not an exotic anomaly. One of the great human catastrophes of the 19th century, and one of the moments when China, in trying to survive an impossible war, began to become something new.